1960s, educational psychologist Bruce Tuckman theorized about group dynamics in a short and quite well-known paper now called Developmental Sequence of Small Groups. In the paper, Tuckman coined 4 general stages of group development: forming, storming, norming, and performing. Later, with a co-author, he added a 5th stage, adjourning. Tuckman's goal was to describe on a most general level how groups go about doing the work for which they were formed. In the forming stage, the group meets and agrees on their goals. Later, after disagreements, groups become more cooperative with one another in the norming stages, which frees them to focus on achieving their goals in the performing stage. But it's the 2nd stage that really interests me, storming. As the group sorts itself out, works to gain trust, establish hierarchy, and so on, conflicts commonly emerge. I have great appreciation for how Tuckman's theory normalizes conflict. There have been any number of groups that I have been a part of, early career cohorts and task forces and boards that eventually hit that storming phase. And there's something truly freeing to remember that it's just a part of group dynamics. That this phase exposes the necessary structures for creating group norms and establishing functional boundaries. Conflict is just a part of the human experience. And yet in today's reading, James is poking at a question about conflict that feels almost too true for us, almost too on the nose for our contemporary moment. What is the church's role in the jockeying for political power? To a community conflicted about whether or not to resist the rule of the powerful, and if so, by what means, James urges them to seek peace and more, to seek the peace our neighbor needs. Now, most modern English translations of this letter strive to kind of soften James's metaphorical language, especially in the piece that we read today, where James has words for wars and battles. Translators have chosen conflicts, and where James accuses community members of self-seeking electioneering, they call it rather blandly strife. It fits this long-held desire to make James's words more universal so that they can be applied to conflicts of all sorts. And yet, I think it was the writer Kathleen Norris who decried our culture's inability to understand metaphorical language, assuming metaphors to be too specific in their meaning, rather than a way that allows the text to open up in more places and more times. Generalizing James's language actually shrinks our ability to apply it, leaving us wandering around in generalizations about community conflict. By attending to James's specific words, it reveals his concerns about conflicts outside of the community whose effects are kind of reverberating into the early church's ranks. So this is what's happening. The conflicts outside of the community involve the Roman legal system. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the patron-client system. But this is about how Rome utilizes this really complex system of government. And by the time James is writing his letter, it's this equestrian class, the ones that get to wear gold rings and good robes in the 2nd chapter. They're the ones who rule the land through military might and intimidation, through the bribery and manipulation of local ruling classes, and through the patron-client system that asks the underclasses to compete for the favor of the elites. James continues to ask his community to shun this system, to stop sucking up and ingratiating themselves to the Romans or to their colluders. James writes to expose the system created for the generational and centralization of wealth and power, a system that creates this massive underclass system dependent on a disinterested and disconnected ruling class. and a system that relies on cheap or even slave labor. James writes to a community of disenfranchised folk who wonder if this faith in Jesus, whom Rome killed, matters in how they feed their family and farm their land and fish their seas and build their lives. A community of folk who think the problem is solved by getting the local ruling classes on their side or becoming members of the ruling classes themselves, which, spoiler alert, the system basically prohibits that kind of movement. A community of folk who think the problem might be solved by challenging, potentially through violent means, the system itself. James begs the community to look at the world differently. Look, he says, this is the wisdom of the system. Self-interest and jealousy and self-seeking behavior. All of these are words that are born out of the Roman system, assumed to work well in every land they conquer. In contrast is the wisdom from above, and its language is born out of the actual soil, the fruits, the yield, the production of a good harvest. James, in many ways, is contending that Rome does not know the people of this place, its seasons, neither the hummus nor the humans. But the community of Jesus followers, they are that folk. They know this place. The solution to the spoiling of their land, the desecration of their religious values, and the enslavement of their folk is community. It's peace among neighbors. It is drawing ever closer to the God who drew close to us in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Is it not so among us? In a time of vast polarization, can we not begin to name the false wisdom that creates division among us? Is it not the same self-interest, jealousy, and profiteering? Is it not the belief that every man is for himself? The scholars of our age have begun to ask whether in the church we will sort ourselves out into siloed congregations that magnify the echo chambers of our partisanship. Or, they ask, has it already happened? And yet, each week, the wisdom from above that we hear at this table tells us that we belong to one another. We belong together. And that what unites us is, in fact, stronger than what divides us. And it's so cliche, but what if we name what does unite us, which is not citizens of a particular country, nor abstract traits of a humanly culture, but what unites us is Christ and Christ alone. Christ who has drawn us to this table where we are met by a God who transcends partisan difference and classism and racism and homophobia and sexism and offers God's own self for us in, with, and under the fruits of the land, the bread and the wine. And so, beloved, in the midst of conflict, the norm of human experience, we're asked to stay together as the earthly, unspiritual, and devilish systems of this world are exposed and supplanted by wisdom from above. Our faith asks us to stay together, to form communities of peace that envision a new normal, a new dominion, at whose center is God, who is love and grace